Hey guys, this is Air here, and welcome to the 23rd episode of Death Row Executions. On my last You Choose segment, you guys were able to choose between Ruth Ellis and Helmut Hubner. Thank you to everyone who participated and voted, and as you can see here, Ruth came out with the win. I would also like to give a huge shout out to Anne, all the way from the UK. Thank you so much for becoming a patron on my Patreon, and I truly appreciate your support. Last but not least, I would also like to give a shout out to Mick and Serena. Thank you for suggesting Ruth Ellis. And if any of you would like for someone to be featured on this channel, please leave a comment under the video titled Suggestions. Ruth Ellis was born on October 9th, 1926, in a town called Rhyl, which is located in the country of Wales. She grew up as the middle child of 5 other siblings. Her parents were working-class citizens and were always present in their children's lives. Her mother, Elisabetta, was a Belgian refugee, and her father, Arthur, was a professional cellist who played on Atlantic cruise liners. Later on, the family moved to Basingstoke, which is located in the southern part of England. Ruth started going to school at Fairfield Senior Girls' School in Basingstoke, but ended up dropping out at the age of 14 to become a waitress. In 1941, 15-year-old Ruth and her family up and moved from Basingstoke to Southwark, London, because it was at the height of the World War II Blitz, where Germans were sending mass airstrikes and bombs to the United Kingdom. Their family home took a direct hit and was destroyed, leaving them with no other option. A few years later, in 1944, before her 18th birthday, Ruth had an affair with a married Canadian soldier and gave birth to her first baby boy named Claire Andrea Nielsen. The father returned to Canada and sent Ruth child support for about a year, but was not involved in parenting and stopped sending support after Claire turned 1. Ruth was into the nightlife and ended up becoming a nude model for the Camera Club, as well as starting a new job as a nightclub hostess at the Court Club in Duke Street. Because of her work, she sent her son Claire to live and be raised by her mother Elisabetta. Ruth was enjoying the fast life and was excited to be getting more money than she had ever received before in her life. Her manager at the Court Club, Morris Conley, was manipulative and blackmailed all of the girls who worked for him, including Ruth, into sleeping with him. Morris was a pimp and a criminal who had previously gotten into trouble for falsely filing for bankruptcy on a company he once owned and collected over £10,000. In her early 20s, while still working at the Court Club, Ruth began prostituting and had regular customers. She was having unprotected sex and ended up getting pregnant with one of her Johns. She took some time off of work, but at 3 months pregnant, she decided to terminate the pregnancy and immediately got back to work. One of the Court Club's regular customers was 41-year-old George Ellis, who was a divorced dentist with 2 kids and was also a violent alcoholic. On November 8, 1950, 24-year-old Ruth married George. He was very jealous and would always accuse Ruth of having affairs on him. Ruth left him on multiple occasions because of his possessiveness, but would always come back to him in the end. The following year, in 1951, Ruth was pregnant for the 3rd time and decided to keep the baby because it was with her husband. While pregnant, she appeared as a beauty queen in her first uncredited film, Lady Godiva Rides Again. That same year, she gave birth to her daughter Georgina at the Dulwich Community Hospital in London. Ruth's mother went on record and said that when she made it to the hospital, Ruth asked her to look at the baby and was weak from almost having a near-death experience giving birth to Georgina. The two did not speak much, and she said it took about 2 weeks for Ruth to get her energy back to normal and about 3 months before she went back to work at the Court Club, leaving Georgina to stay with her. Although she was married to George, he refused to accept that Georgina was biologically his, and their relationship got so bad to where they separated and ultimately divorced. Ruth went to live with her parents and 2 kids and went back to prostituting in order to help support her family. In 1953, Morris reached out to Ruth and asked her to run a club he owned in London called the Little Club. Ruth agreed, and she became the manager of the club. Above the club, there was a little flat, so Ruth decided to leave her parents' home and live in the flat alone. During this time, Ruth became more popular and had many admirers as well as celebrity friends. She was loved, and many men would lavish her with expensive gifts. That same year, Ruth's race car driving acquaintance, Mike Hawthorne, introduced his friend David Blakely to her. Ruth was 27 and David was 24, but they both hit it off. David was also a race car driver and drank a lot of alcohol, but many say that he was nice and well-mannered. He was engaged to a woman named Mary Dawson, but ended up moving into Ruth's home just a few weeks after meeting her. Not too soon after David moved in with Ruth, she got pregnant for the 4th time. Just like her first pregnancy, Ruth terminated this pregnancy and felt as if she could not return the same amount of love and commitment David was showing her. While still in a relationship with David and still living with him, she began to have an affair with a man named Desmond. Desmond was a 32-year-old who fought in World War II as a pilot who flew Lancaster bombers. After the war, he took up accounting and was director of his family business called Cussens and Company. Ruth ended up getting fired from her job at the little club and moved in with Desmond. David was seeing other women and Ruth was seeing Desmond on the side, but they refused to end their relationship and it became violent. Both of them were heavy drinkers, and they frequently had fights that became physical, leaving Ruth badly bruised. Both Desmond and David wanted to marry Ruth, but it stayed a messy triangle. 2 years later, in January of 1955, Ruth was pregnant yet again, and both her and David got into an argument so bad it ended in Ruth having a miscarriage because he punched her in the stomach. A few months after the miscarriage, on April 10, 1955, on Easter weekend, Ruth attempted to contact David, but he ignored her and hung out with his friends instead. Angered by his refusal to answer any of her phone calls, she left Desmond's home and took a taxi to David's friend's house where she thought he would be staying and brought a loaded revolver with her. The revolver was given to her by Desmond, and he actually taught her how to use it. When she arrived at David's friend's house at around 7:30 p.m., she saw his car, but as soon as she got out of the taxi, the car drove away. Instead of getting back in the taxi to follow David, she decided to pay the fare and walk towards the direction David's car was headed. After about 15 minutes of walking and a distance of a quarter of a mile, she finally saw David's car parked outside of a tavern called the Magdala, which was also a 4-story public housing building. Ruth waited outside on the sidewalk, and David finally came walking outside at around 9:30 that night. When David walked past Ruth, she said, "Hello, David." He ignored her, and then she yelled his name again. He continued to ignore her and proceeded to look for his car keys, and that's when Ruth brought out her .38 caliber revolver from her purse and started firing at David. Her first shot missed, and David began to run away, but Ruth was running right behind him around the car and shot him a second time. The second shot made contact, and David collapsed on the road. Ruth then stood over David's body and fired her gun 3 more times, aiming straight for his back. She tried to fire the 6th and final bullet, and her finger kept clicking the trigger until finally it shot out, but hit the pavement and ricocheted off of the ground and clipped a 53-year-old woman in the thumb who was trying to get inside the Magdala. After an autopsy, it showed that one of the bullets was fired from less than an inch away from his back and that he had powder burn marks on his skin. There was an off-duty police officer by the name of Alan Thompson who was drinking at the Magdala, and Ruth asked, "Will you call the police?" Alan then replied, "I am the police," and then took the smoking gun out of Ruth's hand and put it in his coat pocket. Alan then heard Ruth say that she was guilty and a little confused. By the time help came and David was taken to the hospital, he was pronounced dead. He had gunshot wounds in his liver, intestines, lungs, trachea, and aorta. Ruth was arrested at the scene and taken to the Hampstead police station and made a detailed confession. The confession took place at around 11:30 p.m. that night, and there were 3 detectives present, and she confessed with no legal representation. Investigators said that she was not under the influence of any drugs or alcohol and appeared to be fairly calm about the whole situation. After being charged with murder, she was examined multiple times to determine whether or not she was insane, and each medical exam concluded that there was no evidence of mental illness or insanity. Ruth's trial began in June of 1955 at the No. 1 Court at the Old Bailey, London, and she refused to plead not guilty by reason of insanity and instead pleaded not guilty because she had been provoked by David. During trial, Ruth only answered one question from prosecutors. They asked her when she fired the revolver, what did she intend to do, and her answer was, "It's obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him." The jury only took 20 minutes to come back with a guilty verdict, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. Ruth was sent to Holloway Prison while awaiting her execution. She declined to petition for a reprieve, but her mother, Elizabeth, was having a hard time, so she and other relatives went to her attorney, John Bickford, and pleaded for him to help with giving Ruth a reprieve. Throughout everything, her lover Desmond was still on her side, and he was the one who actually hired John for her. John wrote a 7-page letter to the Home Secretary, Gwilym Lloyd George, asking for a reprieve, but she denied the request. After being denied, Ruth dismissed John and was ready to accept her fate. While in prison, Ruth wrote a letter to David's parents and said, "I have always loved your son, and I shall die still loving him." Back in 1923, a female by the name of Edith Thompson was executed, and after she was hanged, her underwear was soiled in blood, so for Ruth's execution, she was required to wear padded underwear. It was July 13th, 1955, just 3 months after she murdered David Blakely, and she was set to be hanged. On that day, Ruth weighed in at a mere 103 pounds, and her drop was a little over 8 feet. It took 12 seconds, but her body was left hanging for an hour. After the death of Ruth Ellis, her family was unable to cope. George Ellis was still an alcoholic, but became very depressed to the point where he hanged himself in 1958. In 1969, Elizabetha was found unconscious in her home because it was filled with gas. She was never able to fully recover and was unable to coherently speak again. Ruth's son Claire was 10 years old when his mother died, and he too suffered from a lot of psychological issues and depression. The trial judge by the name of Sir Cecile actually sent him money every year before he finally took his own life in 1982. Chris Humphreys, who was the prosecutor for Ruth's trial, paid for Claire's funeral. Ruth's daughter, Georgina, was later adopted into a new family and passed away at the age of 50 due to cancer. And now for discussion and question time. While in prison, Ruth met with a bishop and told him, "It is quite clear to me that I was not the person who shot him. When I saw myself with the revolver, I knew I was another person." Do you think that Ruth struggled with a personality disorder? Or have any of you been so mad to the point where something switches and you become a completely different person? Question 2. If you were the parent of a child that was murdered and the suspect sent you a letter from prison stating that they were still in love with your child, do you think that you would be offended? I don't see how sending that letter to David's parents helped them in any way, and if anything, I think that that would make things worse. In court, Ruth made a statement saying that it was obvious what she intended to do when she shot David. Do you think that that statement negates the statement of feeling like a different person? She made no argument in court about feeling like a different person, so why bring that up when talking to the bishop? I understand the nice gesture, but this is my first time hearing a judge personally send money to a criminal's child and a prosecutor paying for the suspect's family member's funeral. How do you feel about them getting involved with the family's financial affairs? Thank you so much for watching, you guys, and I look forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the comments below.